There are a lot of dangerous situations that can happen when using nail guns. You need to be prepared for different situations. The wood can affect if it's raining or not, and the coworkers you're working with can all affect what may or may not happen while using a nail gun. For instance, if I'm using a brad nailer and I'm shooting into a piece of wood, if I shoot into that piece of wood not knowing there is a hardened knot right underneath, a little tiny brad nail, when it hits that knot, can curl all the way back around and come right back out. So if your fingers are too close when you're shooting, that nail will hit, return, and potentially come right back into your finger if you're holding those boards down, sticking your finger to the board. Also, another situation with knots is, although they are hard and so nails may or may not go into them, if you're using a larger gun, say a framing nailer, and you shoot that into it, the knot can explode, sending both the nail and fragments of knot everywhere around. Obviously, your safety glasses are a priority, but that doesn't protect the rest of your face. Ricochets are also a danger. If you're shooting straight down, typically the nail is going to go right into the wood, but if you shoot at an angle, the nail may, if it's hard wood, hit that and then ricochet off, or end up curling right back around and into your finger. Typically you want to be more than 30 degrees away from the wood when you shoot to not have that happen to you. Also, when shooting into a grain, these lines in the wood are called the grain, and the end of a brad nail is pointed in one direction. So when I shoot this gun with this brad nail, this is shaped like a chisel. The nose of this chisel on the end of my brad is pointed this way. So if I fire down this way into it, that front of the nail will follow that grain. But if I turn it this way, now the chisel is pointed this way, it will go straight through that grain because the grain is running this direction. So you have to be careful. Of course, I have a grain going this way as well. You have to be careful sometimes when you're shooting that your angle of that chisel on the end of the brad is pointed the right direction. Also, blowouts are a danger. When you are shooting into a dry piece of wood, a lot of times the wood will splinter, and so you either need to drill a hole ahead of time, use a screw or something else, or it's going to break on you. I have some material here. I'm going to do some demonstrations on shooting into different materials. Most of these guns are set up for shooting into wood. There are certain guns that are set up for shooting concrete or metal. I don't have those here, and that's a different lesson with a different style of gun because there's so many more dangers to that. I'm going to go ahead and do a couple demonstrations here with a nail gun. This is the framing nailer. I'm going to put some 16 penny nails into here. Notice the nails aim the same direction. Slide it all the way forward. Pull back my spring-assisted guide and set it against those nails so that it always pulls the nails up to be ready to be shot. Also, before we do any shooting, once you have a misfire, meaning the nail doesn't shoot, before you shoot again, you should check on it. It means either one of two things. One, the little plastic piece that's in between here is stuck and the nails need to be pushed farther forward, or you have a jam in the gun and it needs to be opened up by a qualified individual. Before you ever service a gun, make sure you take off the air or take off the battery or the gas so that no chance of firing could happen. Some guns actually have a release for letting out the air that's in that cylinder. I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate with the brad nailer now. Remember to always attach it facing down and out of the way where it's safe. Drive it forward with your knurled section. Check your boards to make sure there is no knots or anything that you don't want to shoot into there. I see that I have a knot on the third level, so I'm going to get a piece of plywood to stick over that. When I go to shoot, the nose will depress. Once the nose depresses, then I know it's ready to fire. Currently, if I pull the trigger now, it won't shoot because the nose guard is not depressed. Just like on a regular gun, never put your finger on the trigger until you're ready to fire. So I put this down, now I put my finger on the trigger. If I put my fingers this close, if they're within an inch, there is the potential for it to get a nail into my finger. If you're back a little farther, that's fine, but if the wood splits, you still might get a nail into it. So it's always best to keep your fingers back as far as possible when shooting, and then pull the trigger. Even though it was only 1 3/16 inches, it still managed to hold 3 boards together pretty stiffly. So when I shoot again, now I have 2 fasteners into this board, and it's pretty well locked. If I had some glue in there, this would be a finished product if that's what I wanted to build. Nails are kind of expensive, and although it is fun to sit around and shoot a whole bunch of nails, it does add up. So when you're practicing, make sure you practice within reason. It's always best before you walk around to another side of the table or to a different part of your shop to disengage the air fitting, because what tends to happen is as you're walking around, the hose will snag on something, and when the hose snags, if your finger is even off the trigger, it may bounce forward, and if it's a bump trigger and it lands on your knee, it's going to be a sweet looking tattoo later in life if it still works. I'm going to show you how to toe nail. If I was to put the gun in at too much of an angle, say less than 30 degrees, the nail will bounce off, not go in, and end up in the other board. Or if you're on a job site, may end up 150 feet down the top plates into your coworker's face. So typically you want to turn that more than 30 degrees away from your board, and also you don't want it in the very corner. If I shoot in the very corner of the board, there will be no wood for the nail to engage into. So I need to pull my gun up depending on the size of the nail and the size of the wood framing to be able to toe nail that in correctly. When I shoot that nail, oftentimes the board will bounce a little bit. So if you have a line that you're trying to match it up against, sometimes it's good to keep an 1/8 inch back when you shoot that nail in. And then I go to the opposite side, do the same procedure, hook the nose guard into it, make sure it's more than 30 degrees, and send my nail through. On a 2x6, I'll have a specific pattern to shoot those nails into, but right now I'm just using demonstration purposes. On a battery nailer, the process works the same. Make sure it's pointed down when you engage the battery, although these are a lot safer. There's no chance, unless your finger is on the trigger, for something to happen, because there's no air in the chamber ahead of time. Same process works. Put the nose guard against. You'll hear the battery engage the drive system, and then pull the trigger. This is the Tico Nailer. For putting hardware on, like Simpson brackets, so the nail sticks proud of the gun and I'm able to put it into the correct location before firing that. This one was a little too, pressure was a little too high and it dimpled the metal a little bit, which inspectors won't like. So make sure the pressure on your gun is set to the correct amount. Oftentimes it'll say on the gun what you want the air pressure to be. Typically it's between 90 psi and 120 psi depending on the gun. And your instructor, your boss, should be able to show you that. This is a sheeting stapler. And right now it is set to sequential or the bump trigger mode, which means as many times as I bounce it, it will be ready to fire. Okay, the last thing I want to do is talk about some dangerous situations that often happen on a job site, or are most usual on a job site. Like I said before, the most common with the smaller nails is the curl. I'm shooting into a board, the nail hits some really hard grain or a knot or another nail that's below, and it curls all the way back around. When you're doing finish trim in a house, oftentimes you're using 2.5-inch nails, and those have a tendency to curl right through when you're if they've hit a nail on the other side and come right back out and catch a finger. Another issue is the ricochets that we talked about, especially with bigger guns. When you're using a bump trigger, so your finger has the trigger depressed, and every time you land it bounces. The problem is when you shoot and it bounces, your common tendency, if you're strong, is to push back because it's pushing your arm away. And so if it shoots once and then it bounces back, your common tendency is to push in again. And so all of a sudden you go boop, 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 boop. And it's called a double shot or a triple shot. And it happens a lot on the job site where somebody's pushing, and instead of shooting one nail, they end up shooting 3, and it'll either split the wood, or that third nail, oftentimes because it's bouncing, will sail on past and off and into your friend's face. So I'll do a quick demonstration on how that typically happens. Set it up to bump mode. And I want to just shoot once. So I put it down and I pull the trigger. But before I can do anything, it's shot twice because it pushes back, and your automatic reaction is to push back forward again. So it's really important that if you're on the bump style, that you know you're going to be shooting more than one nail. The better option is to pull the trigger and then just let it bounce when you push that in. And that gives you the chance of just doing one nail. But if you start it there when it's on bump and then you pull the trigger, unless you're really good, it's going to put 2 nails in there. The Coil Nailers, this has a coil of nails in it for roofing. The Coil Nailers have a wire that holds those nails together. And when you're on a roof and you're shooting a whole bunch, you'll find these extra bit of wires laying around, and that's the leftover from the nails. But what happens sometimes is those will fly off the little sections, and so again, you always need to have your safety glasses on because those little wires will shoot. This has a stand on the back side. For a typical gauge roof, it will hold it perpendicular so that your nails are going into the roof at the right direction. It also has a specific style of nose that you're able to push a roofing shingle around with that isn't going to get as damaged. It also has more of a shield on it so that the asphalt granules in the roof don't scar it up that much. Most handles will have a rubber grip on it for safety. Make sure you never point the nail gun at anyone. For some guns, they're really loud and you might need to use hearing protection, so check with your instructor or your supervisor on that. Be safe.